Start with a disclaimer. I'm not a specialist in socialism from the economic perspective or even the history of the movement per se. I have the overall view of it thanks to what I've read in Scott's work and researching Scott in his historical times. And what I would ask for people to do to start is suspend your disbelief this evening. Let's just try and enter Scott's mind, and we can poke holes afterwards because there's plenty of them. What I want to do, Scott in the 30s wrote a little pamphlet called The ABCs of Communism. And what I'd like to do tonight is basically do an ABC of socialism from how Scott constructed it, which is very different in a lot of ways of what people understand as historical socialism. He added some anarchism and democracy and social justice. So it's an interesting mix, and I'll try to walk you through it. I only have 14 pages to get through. So everything should be pretty clear by the time I'm done with you. So really, where Scott began his interest in economics was early on in high school, and he went to the University of Pennsylvania and got his degree there, a doctorate in economics. And he was told by the powers that be in the department that the one subject area you shouldn't really touch is the distribution of wealth. And that's what he did his doctorate on. And by 1915, his questioning of the parasitic nature of the elite living off the workers and exploiting them didn't make the trustees of University of Pennsylvania happy, since they were oil magnates, coal magnates, you name the industry, financial magnates, they were not happy with him. I did a whole long discussion last summer on just who was lined up against him at UPenn. He lost his job. He went on to the University of Toledo, taught for 2 years, and they told him you can pretty much do anything, but don't talk against the United States entrance into the First World War, which he proceeded to do and lost a job and never had an academic career after that. However, what we're going to do is we're going to concentrate on the socialism. And the socialism that Scott was, years ago, John Saltmarsh, who wrote the biography of Scott, asked Scott, what type of socialist were you? And he said he was a John Spargo socialist. And John Spargo was a socialist from England who wrote several books, which were basically ABCs in the George Bernard Shaw vein. And really what it was looking at was the exploitation. And the real core, the real beginning idea that you start with in socialism is the public ownership of all means of production. So that meant that the public would own factories, railroads, utilities, natural resources, any of these things that were used and would be good for the common use couldn't be held in monopoly by private ownership. So that's the basis of socialism that Scott began with and kept throughout his life. So keep that nugget in mind. What happened in the 30s, 40s, and 50s with the Soviet Union and the Eastern Bloc under communism is now conflated with the ideas of socialism and have kind of wiped it out as a possible answer. But again, for the moment, just suspend your disbelief, and that's a starting point. So Scott wrote a textbook with a friend of his at the University of Pennsylvania in 1908 called Economics, which went through 6 to 8 editions until 1914. And then, of course, he was kicked out in 1915, and that was the end of the contract with Macmillan. But it went through 6 editions, and it was used by many, many universities across the United States. It was considered a basic text for introduction. Hello, good evening. And the right over there. So the socialist comes forward in opposition to the whole present order of industry and declares that there is no cure for our modern ills unless we uproot the capitalist system of production and put in its place state cooperation, thus entirely destroying the competitive system. Basic tenet of socialism in the way that Scott thought about it. And again, what he said later in life was the passing of civilization means not destruction, but emancipation. Emancipation from private control of the means of production or natural resources. Natural resources should be held in common for the common good. Shouldn't be held in private property rights and ownership so that only certain individuals can claim and get the profit from it. If folks want to know of a present-day example where this actually works in the United States, if the Texas Permanent School Fund was set up 150 years ago, and half of the mineral rights in the state are under state control, which means the state sells it, which means the state then takes the profits they make from that and put it into the education system. It doesn't go into private individuals' pockets, which then you try to claim back through taxes, which they avoid through lawyers and buying legislatures. So that's a present day, still in existence, in that radical bastion of socialism, Texas. So consider that. Socialism rejects all economic theories of distribution and substitutes in its place a social control of the annual income of society in ways that it deems best to aid the social end. The social end being education, health and welfare, anything that you can think of that presently the vast majority of us have to provide for ourselves individually. For instance, I don't know, say pensions. What's happened to pensions? They're gone. The idea that there would be a pension is something that should be a social good and controlled and financed through the public control of these industries. So what we're going to do now is we're going to sort of shift into... What?
Behind you.
Oh, there's another person. I know him. He comes every year.
Every year?
Every year. So these are the 5 objections of socialism to capitalism. Number 1 is the universality of exploitation. When private individuals hold the means of production, they can exploit the workers. They can exploit the workers where they can make a profit off the workers. They can pay less to the workers than what they actually make off the workers in their productivity. Second is capitalism permits the growth of monopolies largely unchecked. If you want an example of that in the present day, in 2008, we had a financial wipeout, and we had to save companies too big to fail. And now we have fewer banks than we did before. Monopoly. They condense their power, they condense their power, they condense their power. 3, lack of a comprehensive plan of development. A comprehensive plan of development is that the idea of what is the social good and the social need for those who are actually producing the wealth. Not what is the social good for somebody who wants to make dividends on their investments when they actually don't produce anything. That's what Scott would call parasitic living. The plutocrats, he would call them. Number 4, modern capitalist society is wasteful. The way in which it's wasteful is through competition. You have multiple companies producing the same thing and they go into competition. There's a repetition of production, and that is wasteful over the long run. And then there's the consolidation. You go up to this problem here where the monopolies start going in. I'm a letterpress printer. And in the 19th century, there was the Boston, the Baltimore. There were all these companies around the United States who were typecasting. When the railroads came in, and after the Civil War, the syndicates, the printing syndicates came into being. And by the beginning of the 20th century, there was only one type founding company left in Elizabeth, New Jersey, called the American Type Founding Company. And you see this through all the Gilded Age, from the 1870s on, after the Civil War, this consolidation of power through monopolies. And remember, Scott's born in 1883, so it's not even 20 years after the Civil War. He's growing up right through the Gilded Age, and he's in a coal town where his grandfather is the czar of the town. He controls the workers. If he doesn't like what the worker's saying, what the worker's doing, anything, he's out on the rail. Oh, actually, he was a little more polite about it. He'd go to the wife and say, you better shut your husband up, otherwise you will be out on the rail. Husband didn't shut up, then he's out. So that's the consideration of the type of society that Scott came out. He had firsthand experience of seeing this because his father was one of the czars of the Gilded Age. 5, essential evil nature of competition. This was a big one for the socialists, that competition is inherently within itself evil because it is consumptive, it is wasteful, it is exploitative. All these things tie together into the matrix that makes the capitalism evil. This is fun stuff. Woo! And then took it sleigh ride. So this is 1908 to 1914 is when these ideas are coalesced. And then we go on. So what was the socialist plan? And again, these are broad outlines. And I'm going to get to the reason why it's interesting that Scott kept things at such a broad outline as opposed to going into very great details about specifically what to do, how to structure things. He actually gave us breathing space to think for ourselves. The socialist plan, number 1, substitute social control for private ownership. The producer should control and own the means of production and determine what they're producing and why. They should be part of that. It's not just there's a market out there and go and fill it. Is there a social need, and do the workers want to produce that? And then how do they produce it? And then they share in the profits made in it. 2, elimination of parasitic profits. Again, the parasitic profit is the idea of people investing money into a situation and expecting dividends back without putting any work into the system. And you'll notice that basically our 401ks and everything for retirement is now based on the system. When my grandparents were living in Chicopee, Massachusetts, my grandfather worked for 35 years in a tire molding room. And he was able to put his money away in the Polish credit union, and he made 4% a year, and he was able to retire and live comfortably on that percentage. Has anybody seen 4% on their savings? What is it, 0.0125% now? So basically what the financial system wanted to do is they don't want people saving money. They want to make that liquid. So if you put it into a savings account, you're losing money. So what do you want to do? You want to get dividends because you need, price of living keeps going up. So they want you to go into the market because they want your money liquid. And then if you take the fall, it's your problem, not theirs. So what was it? The socialization of risk and the privatization of profit. That's what 2008 was about. Number 3, orderly plan of development and income redistribution. The idea around a capitalist society is almost psychological in the fact that you follow the desires of the market. And what is it? What's that thing about the hand of the market? The guiding hand of the market. Invisible. The invisible hand of the market. And Scott's like, don't trust the invisible hand, you never know where it is. So the idea of an orderly plan of development, again, goes back to the idea of the producers actually having a say in what they produce, why they produce it, how they produce it, and how it's distributed, and that they gain the profits back. And that ties right into income redistribution. The only way you can redistribute the profits that are made by any industry are by the workers having control of the means of production. 4, wasteful competitive redundancies abolished. I talked about that earlier in the other one. Now you have people making plans. If there's somebody other plant doing it better or before you, there's no reason for you to be producing that. You find another niche that you need to fill. So you're not wasting your time in competition or making redundancies, like building the same factory to do the same thing when you already have one doing it satisfactory for the social need. 5, competition replaced by socialism cooperation. This is what I find interesting in Scott's thinking, because he moved on after he lost his job, and then he was taken in 1917, 1918 and tried by the United States government for sedition and was acquitted. He wrote a book called The Next Step. And it was his plan that was published in 1920 by his wife, because he couldn't find a publisher, right? He's persona non grata. But they published the book in 2 different editions. One's really nice. I think it might be leather brown. Scott hadn't gotten to the idea of vegetarianism quite yet. And another one, which was the trade edition. So it was, from what I can tell, it's probably a run totaling between 1,500 and 2,000, which is pretty good for a private. And he distributed it himself through speaking. He was at the Rand School at that point talking. Well, the point of this is it's his first real statement of what he thinks should go on. And so Scott has 5 axioms for economic reorganization. And again, these are very broad. But you'll notice, if you know Scott's work or you've heard him speak on the video or anywhere, he repeated himself. He was a teacher, and the idea of repeating yourself 3 times so people absorbed was very important to him. He had been trained as a public speaker at Temple University. He took a degree in presentation. So he knew how to make his presentations, and what he kept in the 20s, 30s, and 40s, he's fairly detailed. And as you go into the 50s, 60s, and 70s, you notice his texts are getting more simplified. And I thought, well, is he losing his grip? And what I really think is happening here is he's lectured for 30 years and he feels like his message isn't getting through. So he's honing it down to the basic principles. And if you don't get these basic principles, everything else is just chatter. It's just going to wash over the top of you. So he had a tendency to do this type of outline, and this is the beginning. This one might surprise people. Number 1, the wheels of industry must continue. Scott was taught at the University of Pennsylvania by a man named Professor Simon Patton, sorry. And Simon Patton's claim to fame in the academic economics world was the idea of affluence. We'd come into an age of affluence which was caused by industrialization. And that now there was no reason to have an underclass or poverty because we had production enough agriculturally and industrially to take care of everybody on the face of the earth. And then what was standing in our way was the capitalist construction. So what Scott said, if you're going to have a revolution to change the social structure, that's fine, but don't have chaos. When you change over, you have to keep the wheels of industry continuing, because that's what's brought you the prosperity to make this sociological change. A good example of that is when Scott was coming up, he was in the age of the steam engine. But most of the modus transportation at that time was horse and buggy, horse and dray. And Scott became very animal rights oriented. You hear it in the video they're talking. Well, the reason he could come to that was the invention of the automobile. He lauds the use of the trucks that they had because of the independence that not only gave him, but also allowed him to provide the freedom that he no longer needed to enslave animals to help him build. And in the long run, if you have an industrial system of abundance and you change the social system, then you start chipping away. Serfdom went first in Russia. Next came the taking out slavery in the United States. Slowly, we're not done yet, I understand that. But the point is, you take away, by having an industrialized society, with caveats, you are able to extend freedom further and further to more and more groups, because you're in an age of abundance and not scarcity. Number 2, provisions for improvement. As you move forward and you make the sociological change, you have to plan for improvements not only in your machinery, but also you're not going to be set at this one stage forever in nirvana with the social structure. You need to see what can help people make better. Are there problems within the industrial system that need to be addressed? Pollution? Toxicity? Certainly. So you need, in the system, you need to make provisions for improvement and betterment. Number 3, those who do not work must must have the control of production. I find it's really interesting that that's his number 3. But it's basically the wheel around which all this works. 4, justice and fair dealing must be embodied in all phases of production. And this is vertically and horizontally. So you have to start with the guy down in the coal mine to the woman who's cooking the meal on a cafeteria line, feeding the workers. It has to be complete throughout. There has to be justice and fair dealing throughout the system. Otherwise, it fails its purpose, which is social betterment. 5, all must adhere to these tenets. So what he's asking for basically is a complete psychological shift in how we view the way in which we live our economic lives and how we move forward for not only personal but social betterment. Wow, a lot of holes in here, I know, but just let me get through this here. So this is how Scott starts this volume in 1920. Uncertainty and a sense of futility have gripped the world. They are manifestly themselves in unrest, disillusionment, and the abandonment of ideals, opportunism, and a tragic concentration on life of the moment. The future promises so little that even the most hopeful pause on its threshold, hesitant, scarce daring to penetrate its mysteries. The war, and he's talking about World War I, but, I don't know, why don't we substitute the wars we've had for the past 14 years? And what's intent from the Arab Spring and now with ISIS. We're living in a very fragmented world now. The war showed the impotence of the present order to assure even a reasonable measure of human happiness and well-being. Of what profit the material benefits of civilization where world rulers painted a picture of liberating humanity? Remember what Bush said about when we were going to go into Baghdad? They're going to greet us like liberators. Hasn't happened yet. So really, this is almost 100 years old. It's contemporaneous. All right, it's a broad brush stroke, but it very much, I think, reflects not only people, I hate tying the two together, but Bernie and the Trumpettes are out there doing. There's a real feeling of being disempowered, of not having control of the system or a foot in the system or the ability to change it or make it better for themselves, for their families, for their communities. So that's a real concern. You have to deal with it on that level. Well, that was an interesting quote, but we'll pass over that. Okay, so I was going to tie in Chris Hedges, War is a Force that Gives Us Meaning. And he says, in wartime, the state seeks to destroy its own culture. It is only when the destruction has been completed that the state can begin to exterminate the culture of its opponents. So I think that's a pretty powerful statement, and the concern why I think Scott spent his entire adult life working against war as a very active pacifist and losing his livelihood, his academic career over the questioning of that in World War.
How do you define culture in that context?
Culture? Where?
That context.
Of?
The quote.
The first part, just
Oh yeah, in wartime the state seeks to destroy its own culture. I really remember before this whole thing, before we went into Iraq and all that BS, remember Admiral Poindexter? And he was going to develop the TIPS system, Total Information Point Retrieval or some dumb thing like this. And he got absolutely slaughtered in the Senate. People, it's un-American, it's blah, 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 it's security state, it's a surveillance state. Guess what? Poindexter looks like Tinker Toys compared to what's in now. So that's the type of culture that now is down in Washington. You make a step in the wrong direction, especially with war, you keep stepping in the wrong direction. Oh, let's say this. Thus, in the postmortem of wartime, we must understand that what has been destroyed purposefully cannot be revivified. Donald Trump's Make America Great Again is only fear whistling in a graveyard. Now, this is interesting, too. And the graveyard is, let's take a look at the people who are backing somebody like Mr. Trump. And what their real concern is that this loss of power, loss of income, loss of a job, loss of a meaningful livelihood, and it's it's interesting that part of the industrial side that Scott wants to keep on is also part of the problem in that automation comes in and slowly deteriorates the need for jobs. And I don't know if any of you know Eric Hoffer's work, The True Believer. I was reading his last night. In 1966, he said, with automation, 90% of the workforce will be useless within 100 years. What do you do with it when you have a capitalist system that's parasitic and it's not taking care of the people? Well, you get populist movements like Mr. Trump, who think that Trump's going to stick it to the system for them. That's the psychology. I'm not defending it. That's the psychology, and it's something that we really need to address. So the other interesting, and let's take, so automation. I was listening to a man, and he just wrote a book called The Chaos Monkeys. I think his name is Martinez. I heard him interviewed, and he said, oh, you want to take an example of working class losing jobs? He says, within the next 25 to 30 years, truck driving jobs will be gone.
Okay,
Truck driving jobs.
Truck job, yeah.
He said in 10 to 12 Midwestern states, truck driving jobs for the working class are their last jobs. These are the last good jobs. Now, in 25 or 30 years, those jobs are gone. What do you do with those people? You have no plan. Again, you go up here. You have to do the planning in order to, as the development moves forward, you have to make plans for that. If you're going to have automation, there should be a social plan to deal with the displacement. There is none. Right? Fend for yourself. Pull yourself by your own bootstraps. Blah, blah, blah. All that BS. You can have, and Hoffer's saying 90% in 100 years. What are you going to do with those people? Well, guess what? If you don't help them in some way, if you don't give them some reason to keep the social order together, then they're going to go vote for a Trump who wants to burn everything down. So, that was a little sidebar. Moving on.
Scott really said those things?
Boy, was he prescient. Well, I think you're very right there. And what's interesting, again, he left certain statements that seem very wide open, yet very cogent as you move forward. I've been doing a lot of reading on historiography, and what I realize is there's all these theories about the philosophy of history, how you write it, why you write it. And what I've really come down to is, and the idea is that Toynbee had, and Spengler, which Scott was interested around, the cycles of civilizations. And what I really came down to is, like, you're not really studying history. What you're doing is you're studying human psychology. So the cycles really aren't historic. They're psychological responses to sociological pressures. And that was very clarifying to me. I don't know where I go with it, but I think Scott was definitely thinking in that same vein. The efficiency of the economic unit, the mine, the factory, the railroad division, add communications, anything that's up to what we have now in our economy, depends upon the attitude of the individual human beings of which the unit is composed. The efficiency of the economic unit cannot be maintained unless the individuals who compose it are self-acting, intelligent beings. One of the really interesting things about Scott's socialism is this deep strain of individualism underneath. And he was also, he had this theory around world government, but at the same time was very interested in localized, decentralized governments. And what he was basically trying to do was meld the two in that he would develop something. It almost sounds like out of the playbook of the anarchists, but the idea of confederated mutual aid localities, which would take care of individual needs, but that there would be a world government which would provide the law under which all these localities would have to work. Something more powerful than the UN. And also, Scott had this belief that when you did this, the state would fall away and the war would end. That's very, very hopeful. But I'm trying to give you an idea of the scale of what he was thinking through. So what Scott was really looking for was a moral economy. and moral in the sense that it had humans making the decisions for human betterment. One, human values present in each economic unit must be maintained at a high level through an appeal to the finest qualities of the individual human beings. People have to be invested in what they do. If the next step in the conquering of animal slavery and human slavery is to get rid of wage slavery, or working a job you hate because you got good health care. Those are forms of slavery which enslave you to a job that you don't want because you're an economic system that's going to chew you up if you don't have those things. So the first thing is you have to shift that system so that the individual feels invested in the system. And it's only through control of the system that they're going to feel that. Two, the integrity and permanence of the human must be preserved. You have to have current repairs, periodic rebuilding, and ultimate replacement. You have to plan over time. And Scott was very big, even on the homestead, about having 5-year plans. And that people come in and they go, well, they built 13 houses up in Vermont, and they had the maple sugar bush, and then they were up there for 20 years, and they came down to do this. How did they do it? They planned it. So basically, the way in which Scott and Helen lived their lives was an example about how the greater society might do that also. That it would be a group effort, Scott and Helen being the group, and then whoever was around them being invested in the work that they were doing, moving forward in a planned manner to rebuild and to replace and to replenish constantly. Constantly. There was no stable state that you were going to get to in Scott's view of the world. It was constantly turning over. It was constant change. And you had to be very prescient to that and plan for it as best you can. 3, the productivity of the unit must be up to a high level of efficiency. 4, self-motivation and cooperation are the 2 fundamentally important requirements in the working of all economic units. And all economic units are whatever industrial group you happen to be in, on whatever localized level you're at. So, since most of us are attempting to diminish our contact with the large productive units, such as factories, assembly plants, distribution centers, natural resource extraction, we can blind ourselves to our dependence upon the industrial structures. And this is something that Scott was really interested in. For him, homesteading was a way in which to gain intellectual freedom. But he also knew that he lived within a society that very much depended, and he very much depended on industrial efficiencies. Again, let's go back to the simple fact of a truck.
You can't make it like that.
Man, I got a truck with 263,000 miles on it. I love that truck because it's given me independence and I've been able to do what I planned to do. If I had an animal, it would be a very different situation. So the farther that I've tried to move in my homesteading away from the system, it makes me realize how tied to the system I am, which I think is healthy. Homesteading shouldn't be go out in the woods and turn your back on the world. Homesteading should be the opposite. It should be a place where you gain your footing so you can face back into the world. I was once asked at an interview, what's the difference between a homesteader and survivalists? And I said, well, the survivalist is getting ready for what happens after the apocalypse. The homesteader is trying to make sure the apocalypse doesn't happen. If the apocalypse happens, I'm not interested in going and cleaning up the mess. And that's, I think, what Scott would say. The point is you plan now, you take care of things now, you make the social adjustments now. Because once you enter a period of social chaos, everything breaks down. Look at the Eastern Bloc. So, oh, I already covered that. That's good. That saves you guys a page. The next book that Scott wrote that condensed came about 24 years later in 1944, and it was called United World. And in it, he really outlined what I just outlined, this idea of the confederation of mutually aiding localities under the law guidance of the world government. And when you read it, it sounds, and he writes almost in a Hemingway-esque simplicity in the book, especially near the end. And it just seems too simple, too easy, or even simple-minded, to be absolutely honest. And it's bothered me for years. And what I've come to understand, I think, and he says it in the video, and I just heard it, the idea is to design a system where you fold into it the workers' control of planning, but you don't determine what they're going to plan. The point is to set up the structure and then make them have the decisions. Whereas in communism, it was the other way around. It was the decisions were here, and they came down, and everybody ended up in these cogs. And Scott's is a very interesting socialism, which comes up from the base and fulfills social needs from this localized mutual aid. And that if any type of problems come up between localities, then you have a world government which can arbitrate the dispute from a jurisprudence position. A good example now that would be problematic for most of the world is, what do you do when China has 97% of the world's rare earth minerals? Which is basically the entire basis of your entire technological digitalized age. You don't have these rare earths, you don't have computers, you don't have cell phones, you don't have cell phone towers, you have none of it. So what happens if the Chinese sit on their hands and they don't want to sell? Well, look, that's an example of what would happen if we got rid of nationality. Just dream. Just dream is fun. The world's out there. It's going to crap on us when we get out there. Just have some fun with this. So Scott warned that if some form of worldism, a co-confederation of locals and centralized power, the centralized power could concentrate in the nation states, and these nation states would continue to resolve territorial and economic issues by going to war. If you built this new system where the confederation was in the locals, but you didn't have the top-down of the world government, then it could be done through arbitration as opposed to war. The social order that is being ushered on the historic scene by science and technology has made self-sufficient localism anachronistic. And we all talk about how we want to be self-sufficient. Forget it. And I'm sorry, if you don't have rain, you're not going to be self-sufficient. So it's very interesting that what he's interested in, again, is the wheels of industry must continue. There should be controls on it. Workers' controls. If the workers are being poisoned by what they're producing, they will stop the production. Right now in Vermont, we're having this real big problem with PFOA, which is a Teflon derivative that was put into all sorts of clothing. Well, guess what? There was no regulation of where you dumped it. And now it's showing up in wells, and it's carcinogenic. What a surprise. And the same thing has been found now in New Hampshire. You have the lead problem out there in Flint, Michigan. That's just where you see it. There's going to be more problems with that throughout the country. So how are you going to take a community like Flint and replace all that when your industry's left, which was your tax base, and they took all their profits and everything with them, and they sold all the machinery off to another group, and none of the workers got any of that back. In fact, they got stuck with the lead pipe. And then they go underwater, right? Because now nobody wants to live in Flint, so everybody's got a mortgage. You go underwater, you can't leave because you can't sell your house. Who the hell wants to move to Flint? System's got you. So, one of the people, and I really want to make this clear, is that Scott, again, is using socialism to be a form in which a moral economy comes into being. His real concern was social justice and equity. And the only way he felt you could do that was by reconstructing the social organism. And the only way to do it effectively was to plan for it and work towards it. And he did all of his life. Even if people weren't listening, he's willing to talk about it all the time. And one of the people that was, I thought was really interesting was Tolstoy. And he talks about Tolstoy in Making of a Radical. And he talks about how bifurcated Tolstoy was because he was part of the aristocracy. And he attempted to break down the aristocracy and the oligarchies to try and live a more moral economic life. And it really drove him to his suicide at 82 when he tried to flee and ended up dying in a railroad station of pneumonia. And I think Scott took this very much to heart because Scott did come out of not the ruling class, but he came out of an upper middle class position. I think he was very aware of that position, of where he came from, and that these were some of the tensions that he was going to have to deal with. And one of the ways in which he dealt with it was homesteading in order to be more intellectually independent and live closer to the moral economy that he hoped to envision. When he was in Vermont, they had a 4,000 bucket maple sugar bush. They had 2 pans that were 16 by 8, and heavy run. You could be having both of those running full tilt for 24 hours. You have 4,000 buckets. You have to empty those every day. Scott and Helen were not doing that themselves because who's going to fire the arch? Oh, by the way, to fire the arch, you need firewood. That's 40 cords of wood. Whoops, no chainsaws, people. This is all hand cut. So, what do you have to do? Well, they had people there, Lloyd and Zoe Hurd, and they said they entered into a contract which distributed what was produced among the families between Scott and Helen and Floyd and Zoe Hurd. And Floyd and Zoe had 13 children. So they needed this. And I thought that was very interesting. And one time I was up in Windhall looking through the records there, and I found the contract. And it's all lined out. So Scott's talking about this stuff and writing about this stuff in Jamaica, but he's also practicing it in an industrial fashion. As industrial, 4,000 buckets at that time was a lot. They had 4.5 miles of metal piping also up there. So it was a big investment. It was a big operation. And he started this at 50. He didn't go up there as like, I'm 25, right out of college. He started at 50 and went to 70 doing this. So this is really physically taxing work, and they hired people on. And part of that hiring on was this distribution of what the workers produced among them all. They also got cash for working, but they got the product. And the deal was, Floyd and Zoe taught them, and Scott and Helen had the means to buy the equipment to make it all work. But it didn't work if they didn't have the people who could teach them what to do. And they kept those people in the fold by sharing what was produced with those who produced it. So that's just a real life example. Again, I would suggest if anybody thinks that the socialism doesn't work in the United States, last year on the 23rd of July 2015, op-ed page of the New York Times, there was one article called Socialism, American Style. And they go through several examples of it and how it works and how it can work. There's the Alaska Permanent Fund, right? So oil is produced in the state, and the revenues from the oil is put into the economy through government spending and also by people getting checks. Socialism. I know a lot of people who moved to Alaska, Republicans, with a check. That's opportunism. But the system is socialist. So that's the basic outline. Let me see if I wrote anything else. Lucky you now. Again, I'm not a specialist in economics, but I want to give you an overview of the structure and way Scott thought. And again, it was from a moral basis. And that, I think, is really important. And the interstitial holes that he left were for us to fill. And the other thing that's very important to remember about what Scott was talking about, he says this project is going to be generations, if not centuries in the making. This isn't something we're going to, Bernie's going to somehow win the Democratic vote down in Philadelphia, and then he's going to go to Washington. No.
Wow.
Yeah, this is a generational, this is a century-long, epic-changing thing. And Americans don't like slow, incremental change. But that's what the planning's about. You move to that point. And the reason why he didn't give you precise steps as you go along is because he couldn't predict them. Only those who are producing and have the control of their production can understand what the problems are. So if they go home and all of a sudden there's POFA in their drinking water, they turn around and shut down this and go, no, we got to clean this up first. Just an example. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Soon to be a major motion picture. Oh, I'll share one more thing. This is, I've been collecting Scott stuff for years. And we're in a very volatile time and whatnot. I just found this. This is a 4-volume set put out by the Senate, the New York State Legislature. And this is called, I love the scintillating titles of the bureaucracy. Let's see here. Revolutionary radicalism, its history, purpose, and tactics was an exposition and discussion of the steps being taken and required to curb it. Being the report of the Joint Legislative Committee investigating seditious activities filed April 24th, 1920, 4 volumes.
Wow.
Those markers are Scott's citations. They actually use his writing as examples of seditious writing. You have to remember this comes out 1 year after his trial for sedition. Since they didn't get him, they wanted to keep on tarring and feathering him. And then this is the government's reasoning behind what we should do to counteract the revolutionary activities. So, long vaunted history. That was fun.
You're fun.
Did you read through all of it?
Oh, it's winter reading. I cherry picked. It was where's Scott? Where's Scott? But I did find some interesting facts in there. People that Scott knew worked with later in life, and they show that his relations with them started much earlier than I expected, like 20 or 30 years earlier. So for me, as a jigsaw puzzle builder of Scott Nearing, it was very helpful in that respect.
Were there any reasonable justifications?
Well, at that time, you got to remember, the real fear was in 1901, McKinley had been assassinated by an anarchist. Emma Goldman and Alexander Berkman and then the whole anti-war movement. Then you had the Soviet uprising and the German Revolution after the First World War. And then the Western governments went against the Soviets, and you had the white and the Reds and the Soviets. So it was a very volatile time. And the anarchists were very, very active in that time period. It's really interesting. We have some early FBI files before it was the FBI, and they would send in undercover agents to take notes on Scott's speeches. And some of the toughest questions came from the anarchists at Scott, because at that point he had moved from socialism to communism. And so that's interesting, but it's also interesting to read some of these descriptions, because as he's describing Scott's reasoning, you can hear in the writing that this individual's getting caught up and excited, and he's understanding the reasoning and he's following it. And then you get to the last paragraph and he says, of course this is all seditious, and I'm just putting this in because I want to make sure that it's just interesting. Scott was such a good speaker, he almost had the guy, and at the last minute he got home and go, whoa, I got to tack an end sentence on there so I keep my job. So it's been very interesting to look into those things.
And how did he justify himself?
Who?
The anonymous.
Oh, well, then you just do the claptrap of the government needing to keep social control through any means possible and putting down the radicals and jailing them. And this guy should be, drawn and quartered. And just basic agitprop from that side.
So, can you envision with our present setup morphing into something like this before going through a total implosion or collapse of the Soviet system?
I think Scott would say that we had a chance after the First World War. He was predicting the Second World War in 1919. So 1939 was not a surprise to Scott. He'd been watching it coming for 20 years. I think he was, again, Scott has this interesting, he talks in there, he just talks about, I have very few certainties, but I have a lot of, positive feelings towards what could be possible in the future. At the same time, he would be in other interviews, it's like, there's no left. There's, I knew what the left was back before when we were fighting the war and through the 20s and through the Depression. There's no left, no effective left. The 60s were a joke to him on the political activity level. So I think he was down in that respect, but he still had hope that something was possible. Is there chaos coming? The more detailed and complex you build a system, when it breaks, the farther you fall. I hope I'm dead before it happens. Or I hope it kills me when it falls.
On page 1, when you started your definition of socialism, you mentioned socialism being the public control of resources, productivity, etc. Did Scott ever mention the social control of money?
Oh, banks were part of that unit. He hated
money. Okay.
He hated the finance system for that reason, because of the control that it exerted.
Control of money.
Right. So you could do something. You could have a company that was socially conscious, but if it went against the politics of the bankers, they couldn't be financed. And he said that shouldn't have. If this is for the social good, finances should be provided because it's for the social good, not because some banker didn't want it.
Right.
And what's interesting too is Scott got into trouble at the University of Pennsylvania because one of the students that he had was a man named, I can't remember his name. Anyway, he was the son of a man named Stotesbury. And Stotesbury was a financier under J.P. Morgan. And Scott said something bad about daddy in class and the control of the streetcar companies. And it got to the trustees. Because guess what? Stotesbury was one of the...
Yeah.
And so, but Scott's questioning is like, what he was questioning was about the streetcar companies, is that they would not put a fender on the front of their trolleys, so if somebody fell, it would scoop them off to the side, and they wouldn't be run over. They wouldn't expend the money for that. They felt it was cheaper to just make the insurance claim, because their insurance guys were all their buddies.
Yeah.
So he said, well, the social good would say you put the fender on the trolley. So that's just an example of what he was, specifically what he was dealing with. And again, it's at the end of the Gilded Age, but those guys became incredibly powerful during the First World War because they were the $1 a day guys, right? Oh, we'll work for the government on all these committees because you need to ramp up for the war, and we'll only charge you $1 a year. And who are they sitting down with? Senators on the Ways and Means committees, blah, blah, blah. And that's how they controlled it. And that's why Scott said First World War was the clash of financial titans who were fighting over colonial possessions, which is natural resources. Scott also said, he wrote a pamphlet in 1923 called Oil and the Germs of War. He said, wars have been caused by control of oil. And he went even further. He said, future wars will be fighting over natural resources. Because as your industrialization ramps up and you have wasteful production, which consumes that, then the natural resources becomes more and more precious. And therefore you are willing as a nation to fight for it. You think we'll go and fight for rare earth if the Chinese shut us down? People say, oh, it'll never happen. There's a lot of things that happened that we said would never happen. Like Trump.
The relationship between Scott, communism, and the Soviet Union. Can you?
Yeah, no, okay, that's, whoo, there's a hornet's nest. Nice, nice. All right, so Scott in the 20s was brought over, became part of the Communist Party of the United States. But in 1930, he wrote a book called Twilight, the End of Empire, which is where that quote comes from. And he differed from Lenin's idea about development of imperialism. Lenin felt that imperialism had developed like this from the Industrial Revolution on. That the more industrialized you became, the more intense the imperialism came, where you'd split off and you'd either have fascism or communism as a response to this imperialism. Scott felt that there was a cyclical nature, that you could go back to the Greeks and the Chinese and the Egyptians and see this imperial cycle throughout all these civilizations. That's what they kicked him out of the Communist Party for, because he differed with Lenin. But Scott wouldn't, and they said, just change this and you're good. And Scott refused. There's that individuality of Scott. So he was kicked out of the Communist Party, but he did speak. And sadly to say that he was a booster of, he did back Stalin. Scott was so disgusted with what the capitalist system was doing that he felt we needed to go through the crucible of fire to burn off the dross of the capitalist system. And people were going to get hurt. And he said, they're being hurt anyway. So why not do it for the greater good to go through this crucible? I think is a real blind spot, Scott's, because he sort of whitewashed the injustices in the Soviet Union while magnifying the United States and the Western countries. So that's a problem for me.
And he did that also with the Eastern Bloc countries after World War II. He visited East Germany and some of the other countries and praised their organization and structure and ignored the repression that was going on. And it was a real blind spot,
Yeah.
and he really paid dearly for it in terms of the popularity with the progressives back home.
Yeah.
They really nailed him on that, which they should have.
Yeah, they should have, since he was coming out of a social justice position to have this big of a line. I mean, he came back and wrote about how wonderful Albania was. I mean, that was the absolute oligarchical toilet of Europe under the Soviets. So that is a sad state. But that's sometimes where your vision clouds your vision. He had a greater vision, but it really clouded what was in front of him, where he could be incredibly clear and incisive with the Western and United States, what was going on, and be right on target. But then he would be blind over there. An analogy to this, maybe this is a little far afield, but I used to go down and print in Massachusetts, and I get a Springfield station out of a college there, and certain evenings at 7 o'clock, they'd play Louis Farrakhan, right? So, and I'd be listening, and he'd go through what was wrong with the United States economically, socially, blah, 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 and you're right with him. And then he gets to his solution, and you're like, whoa, wait a minute, this is nowhere where I want to be going. And that's kind of where I feel Scott is at times. He has really good analysis, but then when he gets to that turning point of what's in the world that we can follow, it's like, no, I'm not going there. So it is a problematic spot with him, which he defended to his dying day. Yeah, that's the mentality of the true believer. Because, again, he was looking at a generational, if not a centuries-long process, and that we were just at the front end of it. And the longer we took to enter into it, the more chaotic and destructive it would be in the final conflagration.
And that's an optimistic point of view. Towards the end of his life, he hadn't become a pessimist. He was looking for that change.
Oh, yeah.
Inevitably to come.
I think he really believed that it was still possible, but it was a matter of people making individual decisions. There's a quote here. This comes from a debate that he did in 1922. And it says, every man his own radical, every man his own thinker, every man his own ideals, every man his own understudy, and his own actor when the time for action comes. That is the only basis for radicalism. That is the only basis on which the present order of society will be changed. So I thought that was really interesting. I mean, this is in the middle of his writing all this stuff about socialism, but it had to be initiated and internalized by the individual first for it to have any hold. So it was interesting that he could say that and then be so blind over there. But he was willfully blind. We're all willfully blind somewhere in our life.
It's like trying to be sovereign in a sovereign nation. But we don't have a sovereign nation, so we're not sovereign either. So,
Yeah. So again, like I said earlier, sometimes I'm looking at reading history, and I don't feel like I'm reading history. I'm reading about psychology of human foibles and interactions. Is it anything else, or is it too much?
I have a question. In this year, 2016, we're setting these heat records for atmospheric changes. And we've arrived at a point where even if we had like a good form of socialism or society, sort of justice society, or we had enough of any oil or copper or any mineral we had, everybody had enough. We've arrived at this point where we cannot continue to add methane and carbon dioxide to the atmosphere without basically committing suicide with the species. I was taking a few other species with us. And so it's like the solution is pretty clear. We need alternative energy, and the technology is there. But we've got these large corporations that are pretty much addicted to their model. And we see it really clearly everywhere in each state, like with the electric public utilities, fighting the installation of solar, holding back solar, and really holding it back.
Yeah.
And in this state is the prime example. But, so I just wonder what Scott, if he foresaw that addictive nature, not that people are addicted to fossil fuels and burning too much energy, but that the corporations are addicted to their models. And I know Scott had some views on, he had a lot of views, but I just wonder specifically about, reflecting where we are now. We're running into like these addictive corporations that aren't going to change, even when we can see that we must change,
Right.
or else die. And I'm just wondering if you foresaw that, and if you talked about getting to that kind of bottom point, the bottoming out point.
Well, early on, yeah, he really saw that the problem was that the corporations are addicted to their model because it's profit making. Again, it's a parasitic model. And what he says is the immorality of the system is the idea of putting in as little as possible and gaining as much back as possible. He says, and it sounds simple. It's like, well, how do you change? It's the mindset. It's what his system inside. You have to reconfigure the whole system, and that's what his ideas around socialism were. And again, I think, look at what happens in China, right? So they have these incredible smog banks. Why is that? Because of industrialization. Okay, why is that? Because now people have entered an economy in which money is necessary. Therefore, they're not going to shut down, and they become consumers. So now they're not going to shut down their power plants if they lose what they power everything with. It's a perfect trap. And you just keep building that system up into a bigger, more and more toxic trap. Yeah. So it runs. I don't know what to do.
What the West has done is addicted China to capital, is what they're saying.
Hey, it was profitable. It was profitable. It's so profitable now that they don't want to pay their own workers, and they're coming over here and hiring American workers because we're so subservient and thankful we've got a job because we've decimated our own industrial production for the vast majority of the people. Who here has worked in a factory? 2? Oh, 3? Okay, who's worked in a mine? Yeah, I mean, we didn't make our careers on it. That was a passing through phase. I mean, what about all the people? What, my grandfather, 35 years in a tire molding room. My father-in-law, 27 years in a foundry. We didn't have to do that. We're in the next echelon. So we don't see what's going on underneath because we haven't had to live through it. And we're addicted. Hey, I've got a nice car. I drove here. I've got a computer. I like having my iPod with all the music running. I'm addicted to a consumer society, so what am I going to do? Well, I have to decide what I'm going to do. Part of my response is the homesteading I do. So so I produce my own power. Isn't that great? I've got solar. That's great. Okay, but where do the solar panels come from? I can't make those. Where does the wiring come from? I can't make those. Where do the batteries come from? I can't make those. Where does the inverter come from? Can't make those. So I'm still tied into the system, although I've gone to a point where I can produce my own power. What's interesting to me is when Scott and Helen went to Vermont, there wasn't electric out there. That didn't come in until after the Second World War. What's really interesting to me is when there was a whole movement in the Depression area of intellectuals moving out of the cities and getting small farms, because everybody went into the cities to work in the factories because they didn't want to work on the farms anymore, so that they were cheap. People bought them, the intellectuals went there, and what did they do? They wanted to produce their own food, like Scott, in order to get intellectual freedom. So a lot of them, that's what they did. Now, after 9/11, up my way, that weekend, that month after, New Yorkers walking around stunned in Jamaica, looking for land. And a bunch of them bought land up on the hill. And you go up and you see the houses that they built. And what do? What's the first thing they do? Power production. Huge, huge panels, solar panels. Big 5,000 gallon tanks of propane to run their generators when the system goes down. Nowhere. No food production. So we are addicted to power because that's what's important to them to run their lifestyle. That's the change over the generations that we have to deal with. They can't even look at the point, wait a minute, is there going to be no food? Oh, we're just going to go to the store. Oh, the distribution's down. So you see how pulled away people are from the actual points of what are the basics of life. And it's very hard to see how you can change the system because we're so tied into it. And again, the farther I've tried to pull myself away from the system, the more I understand how I'm tied into the system. And to a certain degree, you make peace with it, but you also find ways in which to infiltrate it as best you can. That's why a bunch of people voted for Bernie. Is Bernie a socialist? No, he's a social democrat. Bernie does not believe in the public ownership of the means of production. He believes in private ownership, but he believes in fair taxation and a certain amount of regulation to control the corporations. So he's mid-level. So just keep that in mind when you listen to Bernie. I like Bernie, but know where he stands. He's not a socialist.